Alright, so I was looking at the Kerbal Space Program subreddit, and someone built a plane that looked very much like this. I'll go ahead and show you a screenshot. Yeah, that's the screenshot they posted. And I was like, well, they said the plane didn't fly well, but they wanted, actually, I don't remember what they said at the moment. But I decided I'd go ahead and start recording partway through me rebuilding something similar to what they built, in order to talk about how I design things, and basically how I go through replicating something, or at least something similar. First of all, their fuselage is entirely covered by wing, so I couldn't really tell exactly how this middle section was built, but I did my best guess. I also decided I didn't want to cover my fuselage with wing or have all those Mark 0 tanks lining the spine of the craft, so I did my best to capture the look of the intakes, which is a little hard to see on their image, but I did by clipping two of these ramp intakes. And then I put those based on a Mark 1, and I have a pre-cooler back here. You might have noticed the Delta V says 0. None of these have fuel in them right now, and what I do more recently, I used to not do this. I would just make a plane and then balance it with the fuel tanks full and find out if there was an issue only if I flew it long enough to run out of fuel. But that's a bad way of doing things, so I started not doing that. And right now I'm also seeing an issue with how I was initially planning on using a larger landing gear here, and I was going to duplicate these smaller landing gears back here to give it a little bit thicker rear landing gear. The center mass is actually a little bit further than it's showing right now. It's showing it wrong because of the extra mass of these structural components I'm putting on right now. I use these I-beams to line up how I'm going to line up the landing gear, because as you can see right now, I have them aligned with the front landing gear all based off of this piece, so I can just slide it up and down, and I can slide the landing gear up and down to try to meet it. But right now, the only way this is going to meet is if I clip this medium landing gear in, or significantly change the small landing gear, and I don't really like doing a lot of clipping. So what I'm probably going to do right now is switch out the front landing gear for one of these smaller ones, and I'll just make sure I put one down. I'm also going to put it a little further back than where that other one was, right about here, more or less. And now, when I move this up, you'll see that the rear landing gear are too low. Now, for me personally, you know, I decide what I'm okay with clipping or what I'm not okay with clipping, and in this particular case, I'm okay with clipping these in and hiding most of the assembly like this. I don't like it clipping like partway through the light, however, or like when the springs are activated, it will be clipping through the light. So I do dislike how this is positioned slightly. So again, I'm going to reposition this with those down a little bit lower than the front landing gear. And then I'm going to see if I can lower this in a way where I'm comfortable. See, I don't want to go beyond like about this far down, because then it starts to look like it's not really connected to the fuselage. Fortunately, it looks like that's pretty close to what I need. It's not quite what I need. So actually, I think what I'm going to do in this particular case, this is not something I've actually done before, but in this particular case, I'm actually going to attach a little pod down here, and I'm going to make it two of these, yeah, I'll line it up like that. Two of these, they're going to be empty for now. They might get fueled up, they might not. I haven't gotten to balancing the full craft yet, and it's going to have these like that, and I'm just going to slide it right about there, right about there. I'm actually going to move it forward just a bit. I like to line up lines. Something OCD about it, I don't know. I prefer the look of it when something on the parts is lined up. In this case, actually, it looks like two of these pretty much very closely line up to one of the Mark 1 size pieces. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with the alignment of the landing gear at this point, so I'll go ahead and take this whole section off now. And that's the main part I wanted to show you. I also wanted to briefly highlight that part of how this is designed, the entire wing can be moved as one assembly. I built it all off of the central piece here because I wanted to adjust it forward and back if needed. It just so happened that the way I built it ended up lining these up very well without me having to do that, but I wanted it ready that way in case. Another thing is normally I don't clip control surfaces. I try not to clip most things, but I especially don't clip control surfaces because when they actuate, especially when they're further from the center of mass, they actuate at different rates slightly, and it just doesn't look good to me in flight. So actually, you might have noticed when I right-clicked on these, none of these are activated at all. I wanted to copy the outline of their wing very exactly because I liked it. And so I decided that the main wings actually have no control surfaces. All the controls on this craft are in these tail fins, these canards, which, again, normally I just use the tail fins. I almost never use the canards, but I am copying someone's design here, so I decided to keep that. Same thing with the tail fins. This is not a tail fin design I would commonly go with. It is similar to some that I have done, but it's more a copy of their design than something I would do. And I'm actually going to bring those down a little bit. Yeah, it sticks out the bottom a little bit, but I actually like how this looks, except for this is clearly not lined up, it looks like. Because on the bottom, you can't... I'm trying to think how to change the camera angle so I can show this. Yeah, notice that on the top here you can also see it. This is not actually aligned 100%, and that's the kind of small details that I spend slightly too long agonizing over. Oh, come on. It's not that hard. There we go. Alright, so, I actually like... It's hard to explain. Certain aspects of clipping, like, that is very well hidden. I actually don't like the way, now that I look closer at the way the wing is attached, it looks like the wing's really not attached, so I'm actually going to slide it in slightly more, and I just clicked on the wrong thing, didn't I? Oh no, I did click on the right thing. It just looked slightly wrong to me. But yeah, now it looks more attached. That did throw off the look I was going for with the canards in the front here. They're the only part that is not attached to the rest of the wing. However, should be as simple as sliding it back a little or sliding it in a little. In this particular case, I'm going with... I'm actually going to put it right about there. It's not the best look, but it's good enough for me right this moment. And, I mean, that's what I go for. So, as you can see, this is pretty well... actually, this part... all of this is rooted off of here, so this could have a little bit more flex than I want, which is why I'm going to go ahead and tell this to auto-strut to the heaviest part. You'll also notice these wingtips are auto-strutted to the heaviest part, which ends up being the same engine, ends up being the engines, and that's because this is just a straight line out from the center. This wingtip would flex more than the wing in front of it, or this wing behind it, which, again, doesn't look great in flight. So, yeah, I make a lot of silly little decisions for the design and the aesthetics, and at least it looks sort of cool. That's kind of what they said about it. My version, since I don't know the name of their craft, I'm just gonna call it the KX 843 because their username is Darth Zyno 843, so I figured that's a good enough name. And actually, before I forget any further, I do want to put an action group to switch the mode on these engines, which for some reason the bicoupler, it no longer will let you attach engines in symmetry mode anymore. I don't... That changed in one of the last couple of versions, and I'm kind of annoyed by it, because why? It's a similar kind of annoyance to the annoyance I have with the structural parts not copying symmetry correctly, especially with the triangle pieces. You have to build things very much more manually. Yeah, I also copied how they kind of had this, they had an adjustable ramp intake that they had their top vertical stabilizers on top of. I didn't exactly copy it, but I wanted to copy a little bit. I also remembered that I haven't looked at how far this travels, and I don't want it to travel that far because it's kind of clipping into the engine. And so I always set the deploy angle and the authority limiter about the same. I know you don't need to do that. I've also deactivated the yaw gimbal on both of the engines because they will clip into this ramp intake if I don't. Again, all these little tiny choices I make for aesthetics that don't ultimately matter. Now for the fun part, fueling it up. Now you can see that the center of mass and center of lift were at a pretty consistent spot, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start at the back and fill up as much as I can back here. So I filled those. This one's ahead of the center of mass, but you can see if I didn't fill it, we'd have instability right there. And I'm also going to fill the pre-cooler, which doesn't do much. And now I'm going to fill this, which will bring it down a little bit more and a little forward. And now we're at the point where it really can matter exactly how much we fuel it up. And you can see that if I fill this all the way up, the center of mass is moving forward. I think we have enough control authority that I'm not going to worry about how far forward that is. In fact, I'm actually going to go ahead and fill up every tank on this particular design. The only tank that I'm, of course, not filling up is the cockpit. I also like to turn off the RCS wheels on plane cockpits and take out the monoprop because I'm not really using it. Now, this does mean that it'll be more stable during the beginning of the flight than it is at the end of the flight, but also I want more maneuverability out of this. So I am going to set the very front to have a priority of 3, this to have a priority of 2, this to have a priority of 2, and this to have a priority of 1. That way it drains fuel from these first few tanks front and then from the rest of them evenly. So the center of mass will move back a bit at the beginning of the flight, and then it'll stay pretty much the same location throughout the rest of the flight. So it's a little heavier when it starts, but it's a little, heavier to control when it starts, but it should work quite well after that. I can't spell construction. Alright, and here we are on the runway. A little bit of bouncy as she started out. In fact, I believe the landing gear, which of the rear ones are bouncing just a little bit, but that's fine by me. It still works all right. Actually, I'm curious what the thrust-to-weight ratio ended up being. Yeah, under 1, which is not something I usually do for fighters. And this is, I'm imagining it to be a fighter. It's not necessarily, but there we go. Has more clearance on the back than I thought it did, just because this lower fuselage section is a bit lower than I thought. If I turn off SAS, it'll nose down a bit on its own, but it's not too bad to control. And I'm actually going to go ahead and just pull up really hard, which is not going to go great for the fact that this has a thrust-to-weight ratio less than 1. However, we did have the speed to pull through it just fine. And roll is quite slow, as you can imagine, with no control surfaces on the wings and no reaction wheels to help balance that. I'll go ahead and turn the SAS on at this point. Now, the problem with... I thought the canards were set up wrong for a moment there, that's why I was looking at them. Now, the problem with a design like this, as compared to traditional plane designs, is those forward canards. This is flying quite well, actually, so even with those forward canards, it flies very well, and that's probably because the center of mass is fairly forward. As it drains fuel, that will change, of course, and I can exacerbate the issue or demonstrate what happens when the center of lift is in front of the center of mass by waiting for some of this fuel to burn away and then, transferring some from the rear here, and that will show you pretty well how that affects balance. I'm not really going to do that right now, though. I'm just kind of doing a basic example. We're actually getting quite fast here, even though the thrust-to-weight ratio is actually a bit lower right this moment than it was, and I believe that's to do with our current altitude, because our current altitude is a little bit higher. And it also has to do with airspeed. I forget the exact association between these variables, but you can see the thrust there, 65.5 kilonewtons. In fact, it just increased slightly from 65.4. So we actually should, thrust-to-weight ratio of 0.59 instead of 0.58, and now the thrust is starting to drop ever so slightly. And again, it's all physics and things. I'm not going to worry about that right now. I am going to see exactly what the thrust-to-weight ratio... Yeah, I figured the thrust-to-weight ratio would pop above 1 once we hit the afterburners, and you can see our thrust is still a bit higher, although it is dropping slightly. And you can see we have, we're approaching the sound barrier? I think the sound barrier was at like 300 and something, but I like that you get these aero effects a bit before that, obviously. And if I pull up really hard right now, probably going to knock the Kerbal out. Actually, no, she's really stable right now. Now, again, this is because the fuel being drained is only in this front part of the plane. In fact, it's still on the very first tank. We haven't even gone through the rest. I can burn through it a bit quicker by enabling the Panthers. And let's actually fill this back up, fill the bicoupler back up, and now you can see we will run out of that first tank a lot quicker. And it'll begin draining from these two tanks down here. Really neat little tricks you can do to improve the design process or make it a little bit easier. And I can't say exactly what was wrong with the original plane, although I'm guessing it has something to do with the centers of mass and lift and whatnot being a little bit off. You also might notice this has no oxidizer on board. It's very easy to forget to empty out an oxidizer on a plane. Or to empty out anything, really. Like, I empty out the monoprop here as well. I have a life support mod. That's what's showing the food, water, and oxygen, by the way. And just in case you didn't know that, I mean, yeah. But, yeah, you just gotta play with those values a little bit to see what happens, and you can always maneuver things around. Like, initially, this liquid fuselage here with the intakes on the bottom, I actually had it too far forward. I also actually initially started with, let me just pull up real quick so that I can show you. This little short fuselage section there, I didn't have that originally. I was trying to eyeball the design, and I didn't know how it was put together, so I started with just this adapter and this one fuselage, and then the bicoupler, because I figured this plane was big enough it had 2 engines on the back. Also, I think you can see from the smoke trail in the image that it does have 2 engines. You also might notice right this moment, you see the little bit of how the wing is appearing to change shape, because this particular structural wing is actually flexing differently from the ends of the wing. So even though I put struts on, or the auto strut on the end wing connectors to try to reduce that, it is still flexing enough to be noticeable, which is unfortunate, but usually that's the kind of thing I can ignore slightly. I just hate when it's super obvious. Also, it's more obvious when you're pitching down, which you don't do as much in reality because that's dangerous and bad. Like I said before, the roll is really bad, as expected, from not having control surfaces on the outside. But she's still fun to fly, which is nice. And I believe we're just using... Oh wow, we've actually managed to use all of those now. So now we're draining from this tank. And you'll see that this tank is still full, so is this one, so is every other tank on this plane. And I wonder what effect the pre-coolers really have, because I think they do have an effect besides just being an air intake, but I'm not sure. And depending on exactly what that effect is, they may or may not be helping this particular craft. Because I don't know if they work when they're not directly attached to the engines, other than as intakes. I remember there was some discussion of them having an effect besides just being an air intake. I'm also curious, actually, if both of these intakes are active, because they are clipped into each other. They are cheated into each other. Of course, I just started using the part clipping cheat because the part save files allow it, and because really the main difference is part count. Like, yes, there is a tiny bit of difference in mass from not using a cubic strut to put that in there, but, like, that's not worth it, just because part count. I try to optimize things, so, you know, that's just kind of how it goes. I'm actually going to go ahead and throttle us down real low here, and we're actually on a pretty good approach for a landing, I think. I literally have this is literally the first try of this vessel. You saw me finish building it for whoever's sake, so you know I haven't actually flown it before. I'm actually going to go ahead and switch that to ground altitude because I'm going to want to know where the ground is to land it, hopefully. I'm actually going to turn off the SAS for this landing because I think I might actually do better right until here. There we go. And now I cut the engine slightly before touchdown. I don't know if you caught that, and this thing is stable enough, I can just leave the brakes on and turn off the SAS, and it will come to a stop on its own. Unfortunately, it will take a little while to come to a stop on its own. Oh! Yeah, I decided to hit the yaw to reduce that, and I figured that might happen, and sometimes it's just fun to do stuff like that. So anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this brief look at how I design planes and how to make planes work well.